welcome to the final session, the sixth lecture in this iteration of the sessions on territory that we dedicated to repair this year. We are, this is the so-called, this is the pre-final week of the semester. Some people call it the dead week, and you know, the students are consumed in preparation of their final thesis. And I think this is the kind of probably the most, let's say, spectacular or attractive lecture, you know, that is hosted in the worst time of the year. So I congratulate everyone for being here, because you really reserved your time well, and so I'm really eager to welcome a good colleague and friend, and also collaborator in this very program a couple of years ago on the technology series, Charlotte Malterre-Barthes. I'm telling that only for the recording and the future, let's say the future documentation. Charlotte will be joined afterwards in discussion with Maria Conen and Mio Tsuneyama. Thank you so much for being here. Really looking forward to that conversation. And I would like to also just thank the team today, as you are already accustomed, Nazli Tumerda, my co-curator, I think Maria Maric joining, I think on Zoom, Kiana Zhu behind the camera, Jakub Walter, Alice Clark for preparation, and then a very special surprise, Nicholas Roll, who is preparing in the background, who will be sharing with everybody, awarding a kind of a small prizes. These are his seedlings that have sprouted here in the ONA since March. So all of you who made it will get some of these precious seedlings after the lecture. So I wish you a great event, and Nazli will start by introducing a bit the background of this series.
Thank you, Milica. So I would like to also start with a few words on sessions on territory. It started nearly 7 years ago. I guess Charlotte remembers it very well. And it focused on the future of the urban and redefining the urban in the sense of urban beyond the city, where the debate was on the territory and the processes of planetary urbanization, the urban beyond the human, addressing the Anthropocene and our entanglements in the web of life, and the urban beyond the object, where we discussed the shifting contours of education and practice in architecture and urbanism. And this is the 8th iteration of the sessions, and we are rethinking architecture and urbanism through the lens of repair. We are exploring a paradigm shift in our profession. The impacts of construction of cities and urbanization are being recast in the public sphere, from once drivers of progress to the source of planetary hazards. The critical examination of anthropocentric worldviews, the nature agenda in politics and economies, growing social movements and climate activism are reflected in urban space and are fueling the exploration of alternatives. This pivoting moment across the design disciplines involves new politics and practices of repair, all aiming to reduce exploitation, care for what already exists, what has been damaged, and conserve the resources. So the material and social crises of capitalism are being countered through a different set of values, including sufficiency, care, maintenance, plurality, reappropriation, and reparation. Repair being the central proposition at the core of this changing mindset. And these sessions today are also part of a project, the Great Repair, Politics of a Repair Society, which is a collaboration between Arch Plus, the Akademie der Künste in Berlin, the University of Luxembourg, and our team here at ETH. The Arch Plus issue was launched here in the end of February. I think most of you were present. This was the departure point, and we are now working towards an exhibition in Berlin at the Akademie der Künste in October this year. The English issue of The Great Repair is also out. And for these sessions this spring, we are welcoming contributors to the Great Repair, in order to discuss what is the repair ethos and how is it being translated into practice. What does repair mean in relation to material culture? Can repair be positioned as a paradigmatic orientation in our field, alternative to growth-based and technology-driven approaches to the built and unbuilt environment? And how do we conceive the self-repair of our discipline? This will be today's Charlotte's talk. How are we repairing the construction industry, the architectural office, and finally the architectural education and the curriculum? And on that note, it is our huge pleasure to welcome Charlotte Malterre-Barthes, an architect, urban designer, and assistant professor of architecture and urban design at EPFL, most recently assistant professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Malterre-Barthes' interests are related to urgent aspects of contemporary urbanization, material extraction, climate emergency, and ecological social justice. In 2020, she started the initiative A Moratorium on New Construction, interrogating current development protocols, a founding member of the Parity Group, which is recipient of this year's Prix Mary Oppenheim, and of the Parity Front. Malterre-Barthes holds a PhD from ETH Zurich on the political economy of commodities in the built environment. She is the co-author of prize-winning books, Migrant Marseille, Architectures of Social Segregation and Urban Inclusivity, Eileen Gray, A House Under the Sun, Some Haunted Spaces in Singapore, and House in Cairo, The Informal Response, among others. Charlotte will talk about her initiative, A Moratorium on New Construction, as a possible self-repairing tactic that could rewire architecture and planning disciplines and tackle with the multiple crises that we are currently experiencing. And after her intervention, we will welcome in a conversation Maria Conen. She is the co-founder of Conen Siegel Architekten and currently full professor of architecture and housing at ETH Zurich. Her research investigates recycling, reuse, and transformation of buildings with references to and cross-links with other fields such as art, ecology, science, and architectural history. And Tsuneyama, a Japanese architect and co-founder of Studio M&M. Her practice and research are based on urban living, commons, and ecology. She holds a position at the Tokyo University of Science as assistant professor since 2013, and since 2022, she is a guest professor at EPFL. Now we are delighted to invite our speaker, Charlotte, to the podium. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me here. It's a pleasure. And it's actually not so bad to be in this room instead of the other room, especially considering it's the week that it is. So I'm very excited to share with you some of my thoughts and my work that I undertake with my team at EPFL. You have seen the name RIOT mentioned a few times already in the slides. That stands for, well, what it is, but also research and innovation on architecture, urban design, and territory. So architecture is a discipline nestled within the construction sector, and in that sense, it participates in an activity that constitutes one of the main drivers of mineral extraction and global warming. And to face our role in the multiple crises, design disciplines must correct course to enter the production of non-extractive futures while repairing the damage. But it is coming from a place of hope today that I discuss my research, pedagogy, and design approach and articulate how design can harness its organizing and creative abilities to challenge the current modus operandi of space production and global construction. So to build is to destroy. Construction relies intensively on resource extraction, and the space-making processes from building a simple family house, what you see here in this research sketch, where single construction elements used in that home is traced back to its original material, to an entire city, require in their materialization mineral sources acquired via extraction. And here are just a few of those, all these commodities that impact labor, economy, energy, and ecology. So these minerals, iron ore, aluminum diatomite, or clay, as an example, are then processed into aggregates, crushed stone, sand, gravel, cement, and become construction materials. And if less damaging materials are emerging, well, it is still very much concrete, steel, glass, and brick that remain the most prevalently used in construction, along a myriad of petroleum-based products. And all these metals are violently extracted and then processed via energy-intensive methods to become the architecture of our lives. And what you see here are two works that trace minerals and matter to their processing plants onto construction. On the left side, iron ore, traced from Mauritania mines into building skyscrapers in New York. And on the right side, how clay turns to brick and then becomes the kind of material for these buildings that we inhabit, the architecture of our lives. So here's a linear working diagram, so it's impossible to read, but you have to trust me on that. The attempt is to articulate this understanding of the production of space, by that I mean housing and infrastructures, as setting a series of actors, of events and transactions in motion, a commodity chain of space production. I'll get back to that. So framed by financing mode, and then legal and governance mechanisms, and then design and organizing processes that are aided by machines, the built environment propels the extraction, transportation, processing, and installation of raw materials, allocating and spending resources, shaping, inhabiting, exploiting, and commodifying space, and finally, via demolition, generating waste that is generated also in the form of greenhouse gas emission at every turn. Of course, ecological devastation, problematic mining practices, and pollutions are just the known and spatialized consequences. So in a way, from the middle line is basically land as this kind of commodity that is upon which all these other mechanisms are applied. And the other, let's say, significant but obscured adverse effects of the built environment include debt production, exploitative labor forms, knowledge loss, climate apartheid, and other forms of spatial damage and social injustice that is brought by the industry. So if we look more closely at the construction process of an average building, we will have an oil power caterpillar excavating an unbuilt plot for new foundation that upsets the affected landscape irreversibly. Topsoil is removed and discarded, forbidding the land from capturing carbon and destroying the habitat of innumerable non-human lives. The soil and its living thickness, the microorganism it holds, the run-on and the runoff of water it facilitates, the microclimate and topography, all of this is permanently impacted. Then energy-intensive materials are deployed for construction, I mentioned already. But at every step, human labor is also necessary to extract the sand, to manufacture the precast element, to stack the bricks, or to pour concrete on site. And depending on where it is, this would be executed by a subordinated labor force that undertakes the sheltering of humanity. Welcome. Labor force on construction is exposed to carcinogens and toxic materials and most at risk of fatal accidents than in any other sectors. Once constructed, a building will create these impervious surfaces that are limiting rainwater absorption and airflows, but also continues to consume energy through its heating, cooling, general use, and cheap labor via maintenance. Then it is demolished at an average lifespan of anywhere between 40 and 60 years. Despite what the industry claims, very few parts are recycled, and the bulk of the structures would become de facto debris, waste that accounts for a third of landfills worldwide. So these are only a few of the many arrangements that construction involves. None of these actually showing any signs of decelerating, quite the opposite. So already contributing some 40% of the world carbon emission in 2021, the building industry anticipates growth, and construction materials use is expected to double until 2060. So there are various estimates on how this energy consumption is allocated. Some say construction corresponds to 50% of the whole life's emissions in a building, coming from the embodied carbon at the start of the life cycle, basically what we saw already, manufacturing, transporting materials, and also the construction process, but then also through the maintaining and the renovating of the building, and also during demolition. So the other 50% would be with use, and there are different. Again, there is no real consensus on that, and that varies from countries to countries. But in any case, if there is something that can be agreed upon, that is the UN IPCC report, which says, I quote, "We are not on track to achieve a climate resilient, sustainable world." So to address the harm produced by construction, there is a necessity to pivot toward a non-extractive architecture. And perhaps to mention a few works that are useful for that. Here's the very cute cover of a short graphic novel that I did with Zofia Dierwiecka, Architecture Without Extraction, where we started to visualize what that could actually look like. And here I want to make a note on the term itself, non-extractive. It's grounded in economics. Non-extractive is actually a term that is used to distinguish the value of land from its productive outputs. And recently, the term has started to refer to economic practice that, I quote, "challenge extractive capitalism toward a system that works for all the members of society and our planet." And non-extractive architecture is specifically defined by Joseph Grima as an architecture that considers the reckless depletion of finite resources unviable and proposes alternative towards the production of another way of being that is not dependent on the accumulation of ecosystemic ruptures on a planetary scale, a quote from the book Non-extractive Architecture, Designing Without Depletion, to which I also had the privilege to contribute. And I expand the definition of non-extractive as an architecture that halts its reliance on all forms of extraction, mitigating the complex adverse effects that these generate. So a non-extractive architecture discusses its very purpose and materiality, but also its revenue model, its legal structures, the distribution of the benefits it generates, and of its decision-making power. So how to address the harm that the construction industry generates towards non-extractive futures? Well, architecture is to pivot toward to become the stewards of the physical and the social environment, moving past a strict form-driven activity, but set to articulate circular materialities, building communities, fostering regenerative construction materials, and low-carbon supply chains. That means engaging in a critical spatial practice, and what I have defined as the critical proactive design. So a non-extractive practice that interferes with and questions the standard frameworks of the discipline, that interrogates the brief and project expectations, that uses drawing tools and representations formats to rewire the organization of the working sites of the office and of the school, and that negotiates its legal and financial conditions proactively. So engaging with many formats, a critical spatial practice is not defined by what it builds or refuses to build, but by its actions that span from classical research production, peer reviews, articles, and publications, but also design consultancy projects, drawings and exhibition, but also, of course, pedagogy with studios, seminars, workshops, and so on, to social media posts and cartoons and diagrams and opinion pieces and provocations. So here I locate some of what I'm talking about into my own understanding of a critical spatial practice, what you see here on this diagram that was produced at the CCA last fall, and trying to show what that actually entails. And so to engage in this critical spatial practice also requires a rigorous and comprehensive grasp over the structures, the mechanisms, and the actors that propel and shape the construction industry as a global system. And here what you see is basically a more refined version of that system. The diagram I showed earlier, this one is even less readable. Okay, you're gonna have to trust me on that one again. It is basically about identifying this production of space as a chain to locate where we can intervene at structural leverage points. So where and how to act to transform the industry into this less damaging one towards a tangible harm reduction, to repair moments along this chain. And it is perhaps paradoxical, but I do believe that because of its complicity to harm, architecture as a discipline is also centrally positioned to expose these intricate structures and design the interventions necessary to correct the damage. So architects, as designers and also construction organizers, are located at the threshold between clients, local authorities, and also material providers and contractors. They're informed of legal tools. They're able to make conscious choices of forms, of materiality, and of use. And in that way, they hold a unique position within the industry. With this kind of in-depth knowledge of the interrelations between design, construction, and technology, our organizational proficiencies do equip us to challenge extractivism as a planetary project, a condition we have helped fasten. So with this in mind, the aim is to engage architecture in strategies to decarbonize, depatriarchalize, and decolonize the space production supply chain, an urgent and necessary step towards reform. So to unpack the supply chain of space production and to identify this industry's actor and the systemic operation they power, as well as their extractive consequences, we use the concept of global commodity chain analysis, a method that is grounded in political economy, hoping to reinscribe space production as, I quote, a network of labor and production processes whose result is a finished commodity. And global commodity chains frames this understanding of space grounded in political economy and speak of supply flows as composed of a series of operations and transformation, a set of agents, and a system of markets. So this is derived from Emanuel Wallerstein's notion of the world systems, further developed by Gary Gariffi for industrial commodity change. It has been mostly used for clothes, for instance, or food, and never for the built environment. And I want to also mention that these methods and the themes, so the focus on somehow resources, ecology, economy, and governance applied to architecture, stems from what Nazli mentioned in her introduction, parts of my doctoral research on the political economy of food systems. So it's a formative work that also somehow helped me identify how commodities affect the built environment and uncover the mechanism producing and shaping space. And here was the quote on supply flows. So conceptually, this articulation of space itself as a commodity has already been framed from familiar works like Henri Lefebvre's Production of Space or Neil Brenner's Planetary Urbanization, but somehow the systemic breakdown of these systems which underpins this production and the resulted interconnected view of space, namely that the built environment is produced as a commodity by an array of hosts that process land, materials, and labor, constituting a chain, has not been fully undertaken. Useful works by scholars attempting the task of untangling these material histories and exploitation include Mimi Scheller's Aluminum Dreams or Jane Houghton Material Reciprocal Landscapes, unraveling histories of material flaws, uncovering exploitative realities behind the violent ways of making the built environment, or other works on architecture, materials, and labor, such as Martin Arboleda's investigation on mineral extraction and copper, or another useful work, Sergio Ferro, Concrete as Weapon, which discusses the role of architectural practice within the logic of building production under capital, or Catherine Yusuf, impeccable work on mineral extraction, white geology, and slavery. Belonging to essential research that challenge the innocence of construction and equips us with critical tools as we set on addressing the possibility of design to tamper with the supply chain of commodified space and materials, a task I believe is also for architects. And I want to turn towards these precedent interventions that show how pivoting towards a non-extractive future, a repair disciplines may look like. And this example that is by now extremely well known, in '96, when the architectural practice Lacaton-Vassal won this design competition for the public square Place Léon Aucuc in Bordeaux, where they challenged the brief and proposed to intensify the existing square's maintenance protocols instead of demolishing and building new or refurbishing, a statement on how powerful the absence of building, if attached to spatial care, can be, allowing for design to be answering beyond construction. Sophie Ricard from the French architectural collective Construire sets a similar precedent for a project in Boulogne-sur-Mer. She objected to a municipal mandate that foresaw the demolition of what you see here, these 70 row houses, to be replaced by new buildings. And instead, she presented an alternative budget calculation to the authorities, convincing them to reassign the demolition funds to refurbish according to household-specific needs, skills, and resources. And to do so, she also lived on site for several years. And such a critical, proactive design approach shows it is possible to challenge a project's course and establish a critical model to learn from towards less extractive space production practices. Other successful outputs which results in regulatory reform at a larger scale include the Town and Country Planning Association, a British charity that was founded by Ebenezer Howard in 1899 that campaigned, published, lobbied, and taught about urban planning and legislating. It impacted modes and urban planning rules at national and municipal levels towards community-oriented design, housing affordability, and long-term stewardship of resources. And here, some of the guides that were produced for local authorities and citizens. Another example that you may be familiar with that I want to mention show how a designed action can reform the discipline via architecture education, exemplified by the Parity Group, to working towards a more inclusive and less extractive cultures in school. The group set an agenda to improve diversity balance within the school and somehow profoundly impacted this large-scale institution, changing the conversation around equality and diversity inside and beyond the department. And with this in mind, I want to go back to this slide to be more specific about my own approach, this intentional critical spatial practice and critical proactive design. And we'll address briefly one of these projects, an ongoing work, the moratorium on new construction. So in March 2020, the world stopped and stood still, but not everything stopped. Construction sites largely kept operating with some adjustments here and there. The first lesson the coronavirus has taught us is also the most astounding. We have actually proven that it is possible in a few weeks to put an economic system on hold everywhere in the world, and at the same time, a system that we were told was impossible to slow down or redirect. This is a quote from a text published in March 2020 amidst a global lockdown by French philosopher Bruno Latour. He calls for a reset, arguing that if everything is stopped, everything can be questioned, banned, selected, sorted, interrupted for good. But as construction sites kept operating, the pause offered by the pandemic to question our societal model advocated by Latour did not happen. Critical question about the built environment remained largely unaddressed. So emerging from these urgencies and from this basically lack of action, the moratorium on new construction is a critique of the present state of affairs. It spells out trouble, and it refuses the unchecked modus operandi of an industry asleep at the wheel, articulating the promise of another future. Carving a space of resistance within design and planning fields against the unrestrained logic of profit that rely upon despoliation and exhaustion, it aims to force the collective disciplines of the built environment to confront their shortcomings and interrogate their harmful practices inside and outside the office, inside and outside the school, inside and outside the construction sites. A moratorium asks, is new construction the right way ahead to house humanity in such times? It challenges the separation between design, extraction, building, and politics. Pulling the plug on architecture as simply the facilitator of productive capital, a moratorium halts the damage while taking stock. Do you guys have water by any chance? Would be nice. So to address the harm produced by construction, this necessity that I mentioned earlier to pivot toward this non-extractive architecture can not be disputed. So stop building, obviously, and here's a simulation of a lowering of construction against the business as usual scenario, where a decline in material use and in carbon emission is modeled. But what after? What needs to be addressed, from housing access to value changes to the industry and its extractive sources? We seek to show how a construction freeze can be a tool to slow down the damage while building a counter-reality. Perhaps a few words about the formats. The moratorium first took the form of 1, 2, 3, 4 roundtables hosted across institutions and events, from which I drew many of the ideas articulated in the following slides, which we're all bringing to the fore many key questions. And for instance, thank you. Do you have a glass maybe? So discussing the moratorium during the first roundtable here at Harvard, South African architect Ilse Wolff showed that image of a self-initiated construction, a woman building a matjehuis, a mat house, the traditional house of the Nama people in South Africa, as a way to interrogate what type of construction should stop and where, and who is legitimate to make such a call, and other really important questions and some answers. So the initiative runs on several platforms and formats. There's a website, there are publication, lectures, public debate, competition entries, and also pedagogies, and it aims to push the discourse and establish precedents to turn spatial research into a public matter to be used for conversation in all realms of decision-making, from clients to policymakers, to students, to architects, to citizens, since the built environment is a matter that concerns everyone. Specifically looking at pedagogy very shortly, I want to talk about Stop Building, which is a studio whose brief suspends new buildings activities. Fantastic. Wonderful. Thank you so much. The first iteration, which was at Harvard last year, and this semester here at the PFL, with Lausanne as a case studies. And so beyond new construction, many approaches are available, from designing new laws that integrate the embodied carbon of the existing housing stock into an overall quota by city, or articulating design for disassembly and maintenance protocols, to interrogating preservation laws beyond historical value, taste, and aesthetics, or setting up disengagement strategies and designs for decay, designing anti-vacancy and redistribution methods, incentivizing collective and cooperative living, and so on. And here are a few examples. Here's a project that questions the trend of demolishing highways in Austin, Texas, so a kind of counter intuitive project which uses Sarah Ahmed's concept of complaint as resistance and community grievance as mandate. So along the highway that was to be demolished, that's a complaint map. And the project designs a policy strategy that imposes a moratorium both on demolition and on new construction, with a series of measures to combat the deceptive narrative of post-oil mobility, to camouflage gentrification schemes and CO2 heavy operations. So he is kind of an very ambitious anti-gentrification diagram. And the project actually proposed an anti-greenwashing design that listens to community, including the ones that are usually unheard, from unhoused people to children to bees, merging legal frameworks and ecological measures. The project tackles flooding, environmental degradation, and gentrification. And what emerges is a future envisioning a peaceful cohabitation between non-humans, humans, and our obsolete infrastructures. It also shows that the undoing, the mending, and the repairing are parts of the mandate of architecture. And maintenance is another topic that is investigated with a project for Mumbai that entered into designing maintenance protocols such as cleaning, clearing trash, painting, and replastering, designing reparative works, replacing broken shingles, sistering, straightening structures, but also inventing strategic interventions such as co-living arrangements and additions that are aimed at increasing social empowerment, community kitchen, and daycare centers to strengthen neighborhoods networks. So the project designs an entire repair strategies at every scale, from the home to the city, that advocates for a value shift, with care, labor being of higher worth than newness, and arguing maintenance is in fact a design task. In our ongoing studio, in the case of Lausanne, the brief of the studio is given by the city, who claims that there will be a growth of 30,000 newcomers until 2030. So how to answer that without new construction? And for instance, what you see here is this group investigated vacancy and argues, I quote, if official low vacancy rates point to a housing shortage, unaccounted forms of urban vacancies form a new potential stock of spaces from units immediately available to those requiring retrofits. And they looked at the empty building, the empty for instance, rooms into single-family house and apartments, to the boats on the lake, and to the low occupancy rates of hotels, and suggested those would be more than enough to host the 30,000 newcomers. This is an ongoing works with final reviews on June 1st, if you care enough to join. So these topics investigated in my pedagogy echo the 9 demands that form the 9 chapters of a book to be published in the fall, A Moratorium on New Construction, basically based on all this work that I mentioned earlier. So sometimes people spend a lot of time thinking about something and then they write a book. Well, I put the idea first and I was like, let's see what comes out. And then I write a book. So stop building, obviously, but again, what needs to be addressed? And I will mention a few points. So stop building, every building is a gaping hole of materials ripped out of the earth. We've seen that the cause of poisoned waters and destroyed habitats. Every building is a giant exhale of CO2. Every building holds the possibility of gentrification and displacements, of eviction and foreclosure of the bonds of debt and mortgage. So the call for a moratorium on new construction emerges from this global urgency. And this is not to say that nothing is to be done, quite the opposite. So house everyone. So how do we navigate the need for housing versus the destructive practice of construction? To question the dictate of building new offers a way out of our current crisis of imagination and directs us toward many other routes. The 223.5 billion square meters of building floor area that exist today form the immense portfolio of human habitats to be mobilized towards less extractive ways of life. If distributed currently unevenly, the redesign and the conversion of this portfolio of existing spaces into affordable, safe, enjoyable, and car-optional homes instead of new construction could become the backbone of a profound reinvention of the housing landscape, undoing decades of housing injustice, uneven investment, and extractivism. For architects and designers, this entails mobilizing our skills to reorganize economic forms, legal frameworks, enact structural transformation, and rework regulatory protocols while proposing materials forms of spatial redistribution at all scales, designed from the domestic to the territorial, but also collaborating with other disciplines and weaving solutions together. Dealing with this global inventory of build mask, the task ahead is immense. Change value systems. So if the most sustainable act is to keep what is there and to leave matter unextracted, oil in the ground, laterite under the tropical forest, coal under the German countryside, and so on, suspending building, even if shortly, shall suspend the race for discounted materials. Under the building moratorium, the entire construction world will shapeshift towards this continuous labor of care, expanding design tasks beyond the short temporality of projects. And also by liberating the construction workforce from new construction, its expertise can be entirely rerouted toward renovation, installation, reinvention, rehabilitation, and the production of bio-based low-carbon materials. For instance, for architects, it entails billing differently, charging for care work, reinventing the honoraria calculation toward producing non-extractive architecture, one that halts its reliance on all forms of extraction. So the most value is given to what is already there, and the most valuable work is to take care of it from citizens to architects. Halt extraction. Why and for whom is building ongoing? Whom is material extraction benefiting? Globally, with potentially overbuilding on one side and lack of housing on the other, could a new construction moratorium be limited to extractive nations with a consolidated building stock dividing countries along GDP lines? But the construction industry ramifications are tentacular and global. And even if construction activities are not evenly distributed worldwide, many of the resources used are extracted outside of the regions that see the most construction. Achille Mbembe says, in Africa especially, but in many places in the global south, energy-intensive extraction, agricultural expansion, predatory sales of land, and destruction of forests continues unabated. Contextual complexity calls for a deeper on-look on where and what is constructed and what should not be built. But I'll take the call to halt extraction beyond resource mining as one that is subtending to the extraction of wealth, of bodies, and cultural extraction. Paraphrasing Reinhold Martin, grounded in capitalism, it is the reorganization, expropriation, and idealization of nature and of the colonial and post-colonial hinterlands as a site of resource extraction, a source of labor, and an object of aesthetic contemplation that is to be repaired. And the construction industry must engage fully in this work. And to do that, extraction must halt. As we revert to less damaging, bio-based, low-carbon materials, to echo Olufemi Taiwo, we'll need to engage in constructing this repair, both backward and forward-looking. And there is so much design work to do: mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage outlines, carbon removal, and so on. Revolutionize construction. So we're confronting an economy that represents $10 trillion yearly. That's daunting. But revolutionizing construction implies the profound overhaul of how space is produced, in a way addressing that chain I was drawing before, exploring financing alternatives to debt and mortgage, a profound revision of thermal standards, of design processes, the decarbonization of materials, of construction methods, and of the construction sites, rethinking housing allocation programs, and so on. Buildings involve a collective responsibility that does not only concern architects, investors, the state, local authorities, elected representatives, material manufacturers, transporters, construction companies, developers, norm makers, and once built, inhabited, demolition, and recycling companies. So a revolutionized construction sector disengaged from the idea that nature is both the backdrop and the supplier of our human project, to articulate an authentic practice of sustainability in construction, one that is political in nature. Fix the office. So this used to be called kill the office. I changed it because I do believe that the office can be fixed. Also, I don't want to lose friends. The complicit role that design offices play in environmental degradation, social injustice, and climate crisis cannot be ignored. So how can the design practice, from conception, planning, financing, and internal functioning, be edited? A large majority of practices are still patriarchal, hierarchical, exploitative structures based on single authorship, at times unable to address the climate emergency because of this obsolete functioning. Everything in the current design office model with the value-generating schemes that's relying on a culture of overwork, poor labor conditions, and oppressive internal power relations must be rectified, as it stands in the way of the collaborative and collective endeavors necessary to tackle the crisis. There are other models. There are other instances like Rotor and Assemble, unperfect, but also showing that conducting different forms of practice, such as pioneering reuse and participation, requires alternative ways of being an office, in this case, a collective. There are also corporate, yet alternative examples, such as the employee-owned shared plans or employee benefit trusts that have been tested. The Catalan office known for setting up and designing housing cooperatives, also organize itself structurally as a worker cooperative with equal salaries distributed among the members. A step further toward a fair production of space, the radical office Guegui, located in the Karen territories on the Thai-Burma border, shares equal salaries among architects and construction workers. Many practices, such as Brazilian Usina, registered as an NGO, seek no profit, with subvention and donation used to cover operative costs and salaries. But pivoting requires an in-depth self-examination regarding labor conditions and power relations within and outside of the office. Design offices are to fulfill their mandate through resource stewardship, to start to deploy these organizing abilities to think about other ways of practicing, not building less, building with what exists and caring for it. Reform the school. Contemporary education holds the keys to many answers, yet it is plagued with the same issues that precludes the entire industry from changing. a limited amount of references given, a limited amount of teaching methods, a limited amount of iconic figures in theory and in practice. This is the canon, preventing us from accessing a wealth of possible options, offering alternatives to the way we answer design questions. From climatic solutions found in global vernacular architecture to collective organizational systems articulated by feminist radicals or indigenous communities, the ingenious catalog of human habitat is extensive but undisclosed. As we reinvent the studio format, questioning critiques as rigid assessment methods, investigating other forms of teaching, from walking symposiums to critical mappings and readings, learning and unlearning together, discussing construction materials from the point of view of colonial extraction, or addressing traditional crafts from the scope of labor and race, institutions have the option to make lasting changes in their curriculum, also through hiring and admission policies. So to paraphrase Fred Moten, decolonizing, depatriarchalizing, and decarbonizing the university may not be possible, but these decolonial, emancipatory, and true sustainability-oriented works are to be conducted within the institution. And here, I want to mention this work articulated with my friend and colleague Dubravka Sekulic, something that you could refer to fitting in the frame of this critical spatial practice I mentioned earlier, frameworks for curriculum repair. As an example, prioritize reuse, interrogate material flows, challenge individual authorship, challenge hierarchies, but accept responsibilities, address the classroom as a physical space, challenge project temporalities. The work on curriculum repair is never finished. It flourishes in ongoing reorientation, reorganization, and rearticulation. It was published in this work that you all know, of course. And this is actually pinned in the wall, on the wall of my own studio. And we discuss it extensively as something that is a guideline to live for. We have not obviously achieved half of what is in there. It's an ongoing work. Don't dig. So suspending new construction to look into regulating extraction and stopping demolition worldwide, and then a no digging policy. This allows for earth, soil, dirt, waste to be reconsidered for what it is, valuable matter. Not digging not only entails to stop new construction, to value the unbuilt, but also suggests entering into restorative policies to withdraw from entire territories to let them recover their fertile and ecologically rich conditions, signaling the great return of the terrain vague, the fallow land, the uncultivated, that architecture and planning discipline have long perceived as inert, as the passive ground upon which design can be deployed. A call against solutionism. Don't dig means to treat soil, humus, and humans are companions, and to think about multi-species eco-justice as contended by Donna Haraway. Finally, take care. In our societies seeking to create themselves anew constantly, maintaining what exists is not that popular. Preserving, nurturing, cleaning, repairing, and fixing are disrespected, perceived as dirty and irrelevant, and performed by racialized and gendered low-paid laborers. But maintenance is a daily radical work of repeated gestures and activities, unstated yet essential. If considered a path to real sustainability, maintenance offers to architecture the chance to completely reassess the value-generating chain of spatial production, pointing towards a possible way out of the crippling resource consumption that is generated by the construction industry. So the evident yet radical act is thus not to build, but to value and design spatial protocols of care and repair, allowing the world to function and appreciating those who make it work. I go back to this slide and basically relocate this ongoing project, A Moratorium on New Construction, as part of a larger vision and a project we work towards at the lab Riot, aiming at paradigmatic shifts in the way space is produced. So these 9 demands merge with systemic leverage points located all along the commodity chain of space production. And we are here drawing on Donella Meadows' definition of leverage points, places to intervene in the systems. I quote, "These points are places within a complex system, a corporation, an economy, a living body, a city, an ecosystem, where a small shift in one thing can produce big changes in everything." To conclude, we seek to identify key moments of repair, targeting maximum effect to affect entire portions of the space production supply chain, working on financing modes, on laws, on construction standards and norms, on material regulations, and of course, design and education practices with the tools of architects, the materiality and the ingenuity of the profession. We aim to design interventions toward non-extractive futures so that there's a future at all, making architecture and the building industry fully engaged in this reparative work. Here's the quote. So I want to leave you with this image, a contribution to the architecture magazine Karta, produced together with Zofia Dzierwiecka, how we can repair ourselves, but also potentially how architecture can repair itself by embracing the rise of practices that are pushing for social agendas in the built environment, and how we as designers can harness our abilities to challenge this current modus operandi of space production towards non-extractive futures. Thank you.
So I'm really excited to have heard the draft.
Finally.
This is really fantastic because this book is coming up, and it's so perhaps we could also understand this conversation as a kind of let's say engagement with the draft, right? Perhaps they could contribute,
It's about half written.
to write.
Don't tell my publisher.
Yeah, to let's say the writing of this. Right? So let's say this. I think here we need to be muted. So perhaps. I find it really fascinating that you have, you have found this, if I can say it like that, you have found this voice which is very which I think captures, the kind of thoughts and sentiments and experiments. You're speaking, if I say, for a situation, I think this is very interesting. So you have this voice that somehow captures the child, if I may say so, right? And I think this is really very, very successful and interesting. And I really congratulate you on that because it requires courage. It requires courage, no? And I think this is fantastic. So I really applaud you on that, no? And so now I could be, maybe we could start with some maybe curiosity. So have you ever been to the moratorium in front of us? Incorporate, like let's say maybe a kind of policy or some people who seriously produce concrete or building components or those that would be presumably very, very affected by the idea of stop building, and how what are the reactions there?
I mean, I haven't I don't think I've really reached out to the industry actors yet. It's in the making. Okay. I've addressed. I did a talk at the ESIA Congress in Lausanne, which I thought would go really bad. But it turned out to be quite the opposite. It turned out that this thing, I mean, maybe that relates to what you were saying about the zeitgeist, that actually a lot of people were really interested in change and how that can be fostered. So it was actually very rich and triggering conversation. I've also brought that to representative of the people, so the state. So I've been in conversation with MPs, people that represent people in the parliaments, so the Swiss parliaments, which have said that they can confidently say that the parliament is not ready for a moratorium on new construction. However, they see how useful a radical call can be to signal to politicians and lawmakers that the change is urgent. In a way, they don't want that kind of radicality, but they would propose something less radical, but that would still mean change, right? So there was that, which I think was a really useful feedback in a way to see how that was potentially efficient. And then I've also been in touch with the Ministry for Economy, Construction, and whatever, they have a very long name. They were terrified. So they were like, we can't be associated with this kind of initiative. This is very bad for us. Which also speaks of, I think, to the need for such initiatives. So, well, yeah, I'm yet to be invited by but I think, the funny thing is that discussing with people like Marc Angelin, who have been very close to actors in the industry, he, for instance, says that there is a kind of awareness also in these strata about the need for change. Of course, this is very dangerous because it's also connected to greenwashing, basically, and the fact that low carbon concrete and things like that would mean we can just continue to do what we do. We will just do it in a less harmful way. Which, of course, the moratorium is not saying that. So it's kind of the radicality of it means it might be, to a certain extent, protected from that greenwashing kind of risk. But yeah, so I'm yet to talk to the big guy. I look forward to inviting you.
Yes. So I'm curious. Maybe we should immediately invite Maria, because your of course your practices, your probably historical. So let's say Charlotte is sort of give us all this kind of umbrella sense of ideas that we can use, in approaching the office, the curricula, and so on. And you are working in a concrete contracts most of the time. Also, you're teaching, and so from that perspective, we could also, come perhaps also remind afterwards how perhaps we see the story of the development and so on. Right? So do you see what would you contribute to Charlotte's movement from the perspective of your work? I mean, you have built the whole house, let's say, or you repaired your house, right? And the rest of the way, right? What did you learn to do that?
Yeah, so as you said, like Charlotte makes the umbrella, and like so as like as a practice, we started to kind of like without having any umbrella, but started to kind of fix the problem. And like now I feel like this kind of big umbrella, like the global issue is like shared all over the world. But as you mentioned, like in your chart, like land at the site, so site is very local, and also like the technology, culture, and also soil itself. So I think that this kind of like two direction is very important to have. And I think as I always like picking the ground and having without any umbrella, I think this was somehow very good connection to the world. Okay. Then again, I felt bit responsible to like having this umbrella and what way I should react to the construction site. And like probably it's a very diverse answer. It's depending on the climate, culture, and also like the condition and also mentality of the people, and we can't start from like convincing like big company, but like started to kind of make like small example and showing them and convince them. So like it's kind of step by step. So yeah, I think this was encouraging us like having this umbrella. And I feel also the pressure.
Yeah, but I try not to moralize. I think it's not. I mean, I think we're all complicit in the redistribution as well. Because, like, I think that currently there's a tendency to do carbon shaming, finger pointing, and things like that. I can see how they can be valid for campaigns and things like that, but I think that as we reflect collectively, moralizing is not necessarily the right way. Like there's the clickbait provocation and all that, so now you're listening, okay, great. And then, how do we actually engage in the work? I think there's like, so, I mean, I know your work, I think it's incredible, I think it fits very well in the call, so
yeah,
don't feel too much pressure. I think you're actually doing that for
No, I think it's a good pressure. But I still did the ground.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, of course you do.
I think this kind of also like we have a program also like kind of develops the country, kind of forcing it to the undeveloped country what we think like because we already built a lot of things, we have a lot of stocks, and like what they have is very different. So of course like we shouldn't normalize, we can't share like all the same platform with like a discussion as you did like with the Zoom. I think it's a very somehow I would like to invite you to the committee.
I mean, perhaps what I find interesting. So your practice, you have spoken about this. I can't really repeat the words, but basically that there are alternative ways of doing the office, right? And that many different kind of ways of reinventing the practices. And so your example was interesting because you experimented in your own environment or with yourself in a way, right? So that is and I think with your own house, and I think there is a kind of interesting honesty about that, right? But it's also very local, so you kind of start with yourself in order to relearn or kind of unlearn and relearn, and you remove the pain. So it's very interesting. But what did you learn in the sense of what does that mean for the office? Like, where would you go with your office from now on? You're a young architect, right? So what, maybe you can ask Charlotte.
Yeah, of course, still I have a little bit dream of having big office, winning a lot of competitions, But like somehow like I feel also at the same time not the right way or like not fitting. I'm the person like who are not probably who are more excited to experiment things and also like see what is my skill with what I can get from through this experiment, which I could have probably during I grew up in Serbia. I didn't meet any animals, no contact from the soil, all depending on the services. And I have somehow kind of felt lost my wildness or skill which I should have as an architect. How to read the wind, how to protect from the water, the buildings. And this is a kind of like knowledge which we could have if we have contact with environment, if we grew up wildness. But my mom always went to a contractor to fix the toilet. We never learned how to work with it. So somehow, like for me as an architect, it's missing part to design architecture with the environment, to be sustainable and also to coexist. So I think after maybe I learned this through this experiment, maybe I can leave the companies. Grow my own place.
I mean, there are a couple of interesting points there which somehow also, weave into the spirit of the moratorium. So one point is this kind of role of the expert, the role of the layman, right, in these new systems. No? And so maybe this is something that didn't come out explicitly, right? But somehow I would understand this sort of reparative action as or repair as building, right? So this is not the kind of a new building, but it's so we don't stop building, we don't stop all of it, right? But this kind of certain kind of building which has this somehow it is part of life, or which is connected to maintenance, or simply, connected to sort of living or sort of adapting space to uses, somehow. I understand it as a kind of very democratic, right? So in a way, people, they should also be empowered to be able to do that, or re-empowered, right? So building used to be much more, part of a common knowledge, right? And we are, in recent history, it has become a kind of expertise. So I'm curious about that. Yeah? So what if we can fix the office, let's say these new practices that we even also assemble or certainly they work also with communities, and there is this kind of similar to what Miguel describes, right? So there is a kind of a different set of skills that is involved, which go beyond this sort of design on paper, right? So the architect is somehow re-embedded, let's say, in the society, in the building process and so on, right? But in a way, it also raises the question: who has the knowledge, in the end, right? What is the role of the expert? So I'm curious a little bit about that, how you see it.
I think I'm actually very suspicious to the term expertise, which I think, especially in this, and I'm sure I think the kind of, for instance, increase of technology within construction, for instance, has, for instance, really led to this idea that you will not be able to fix any of this yourself. So the expert will know. So there is a kind of gatekeeping of certain form of knowledge that is basically more and more happening, right? And kind of over equipment. I mean, everything. You will not be able to fix a car because it has like so many parts. And in a way, the same goes with the kind of devices that are in the architecture today.
I mean, now the new expertise is kind of decarbonized.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, what is an architectural practice? I think that's the first thing we should discuss, because I think there is not one architectural practice we always talk about team architect, but I don't know what this is at the end, and I think that shouldn't be any more the point how we should discuss this profession, because as we also know, people who study here at school, they do so many different things after the studies. No, they start to work in at the city level, or they do their. I mean, there are now already so many different practices coming out from the school. So already there, I think it's very difficult. That would be one question of also used to point out a bit what kind of architectural practice do you talk? Because I think there is practices that really work only by doing their own projects. There are practices they are doing a lot of curricula assemble. I think they are also doing new construction, they do projects, so that it's just a very wide range. But I think also you talk much more about the organization, also how they are organized as an office in the kind of how they found. So I think, there we should be really careful, because I think we cannot take this profession as one thing and the office as one thing. And I think also that would be one point that is very important if you talk about the rethinking of the curriculum. I think it's also to what should we teach, or kind of what should people learn. I think there's not one right way. I think we are, in our days, things are so complex, so multi-layered. So I think we should be really talking about this, that there is a lot of layers, a lot of things, and in this frame there should be a lot of space for a lot of different practices. So if we now already start again to say it should be like this and that, we frame again already the solution, and I don't know if we have already the solution. That's also one point to say we have to stop the new construction, because we don't know what does it really mean. For me, that's one point.
Yes, of course.
To say that. So that's also a bit difficult for me now, because the schemes you show, the kind of chains, I could not really read them, so that's, but I think they are very important, because I think they would also, is there written the architectural office, or what is the architect at the end? And I think therefore also what is the expert? I don't know, because I think that's also something we learn. We make so much collaboration with others. I think that's also the nice thing to be at a school like here. You can ask other people to collaborate, you discover things. I think this kind of not anymore knowing everything what it means is already the first step towards this new way of making architecture or making spaces. It's maybe much more this making spaces, because I think that's still something we need now. We need spaces to live in, we need, but also how do we live? How much space do we need? All of that is in a way an ongoing process. So I think that's a bit during the lecture I was always wondering, because there is now this vision of one, and I think there is a very specific way of construction you were also criticizing.
I talk about them. Actually, what I talk about is a kind of. So, for instance, for the architecture practice, I take the architecture survey of the EU 27, which is looking at the architecture practice as kind of the data, which says a majority of the architecture office is like 1 or 2 people, for instance, with like led by 1 or 2 people, with like an average of like 2 or 3 employees, and then you have the next one, which is like the bigger office and stuff like that. So I look at it as a kind of general format. I also refer to, of course, my own experience. I've worked in offices. I also get a lot of returns from people working in architecture office, and also listening to what new groups that are addressing working conditions in architecture offices are talking about. I'm thinking about future architects, for instance, or
The Union of Architectural Workers, they were there. I mean, I think that there is a kind of consensus on, I'm not talking about like the niche architecture office, which in fact is very close to us and is not the majority. And I think that these offices, for instance, they nevertheless produce a kind of type of architecture that is the one that we see around us, that produce the majority of what is being constructed. And they also work in a kind of relatively similar mode. So this is the kind of architectural practice I'm referring to.
But if you refer to them, they are, because I think also you put quite a lot of pressure of these two people offices, no? In the sense of they are part of a big system. So can you put the architect in the center of this system? Or why the architect is in the center? Is it because we are architects and looking from this perspective? Or if you would look now on a bigger chain, isn't the architect a very small point in this whole chain? And to say now that this kind of office needs to fulfill everything is quite, for me, it's always this question of, how could you act there? So I think the question of you asking, did you talk to Holcim, did you talk to Implenia, would be very important, because I think I remember just, for example, making construction out of wood in the inner city of Zurich was only possible, or was not only possible, but started to be possible, more possible, when Implenia started to have their wooden construction part. So there it was clear it can be done in a bigger thing. So I think, a lot of things are then starting to come on the market, and then these kind of these kind of architecture offices that you described start to work on that, because they have otherwise not the capacity to act. So in this sense, and the clients are very important, no? So,
I mean, I actually had a very long conversation with a colleague of us that I will not name, because I didn't ask her if she wants to, so I won't ask her. But I actually sent her the chapter on the office, which is actually written. So I sent it to her, and then she answered very much in line with you, saying, well, we're doing what we can. For instance, I mean, this was more about, like, not necessarily about the architectural outputs, but rather about the kind of labor practices within the office.
but I'm not talking now about.
This is the same, but because this is the pressure on the kind of these two people. It's also, when I talk about fix the office, I talk about the internal functioning of the office also. And I think there, for instance, there is definitely possibility for improvement in any case. And I wonder, to me, the question is like, how much of this is connected to what is being produced? So is there a causality? If you're, Leslie Loco had a quote a few weeks ago which says, it is as much about how you run your office as what you produce as an architectural practice. So in a way, I think these things are not necessarily decoupled. Will you produce something very, but aware or consciously aware? Or like, I understand what you're saying,
because
which is
the
market,
the market produces demands, no? And the demands is then kind of that these people answer to this market. So that's why I say, for sure, you can choose then in this market, how do you deal with that? But the market that is set up, and that's the kind of economy we are in, is kind of setting up these conditions. So in this sense, do you think now this office can change the market? I mean, if everyone would agree to that, I'm also sure we could do it. I'm not, but I think that's a bit my question in this how we could look at this. That's why I think this diagram is so important.
It's not, I don't think you can fix everything as the office, but I do think that there is action possible in that at that moment. I do mention that this is an entire chain of production, so obviously it's not just the architect that can be doing that. I think that, for instance, the whole industry is not doing what it could or what it should, so that's very clear to me. I'm like, also, the discussion on
client and honoraria, you know, the deregulation of SEA and things like that. I mean, I think they are also not doing their part, meaning they also have kind of dropped the ball. The fact that, for instance, the way they calculate carbon is acknowledging that a building that exists since 30 years is decarbonized because it's old enough. I mean, I think that there is, to me, my kind of anger at one point would just say that at every point there would be something to be done, and that's just not happening. That's my impression, is that a lot of the work that is happening is not, it's either at times not really serious, you know. I mean, I think the low carbon conversation is just incredibly slow. I mean, there is a kind of also hindrance on that. And then I think that also my point with the architecture practice is that as architects we do harm, so we should also be able to undo that harm. And that I'm not sure how much of that consciousness has landed in the office. And that relates to how you treat the people that are your interns, to how you will decide which job to be done. And I'm very aware that this is part of an ecology, and that of course there are clients doing certain things, and the city has also a responsibility.
The politics are very important, because I think politics, that's the same thing with the flying around the world. I think there you could in a way change.
I mean, there are perhaps in this conversation I could sort of comment on two questions. So one is this kind of difference between let's say the kind of rule-based behavior, you know, the kind of normative behavior, and the kind of a cultural shift, right? And I think that's you know, perhaps I'm curious about you know, I mean, could we approach this discussion also somehow through the kind of cultural lens, right, or kind of philosophical lens, right? So to somehow go deeper to the because I'm not sure, or you know, I'm not sure whether sort of by tweaking, to say so, the rule book, you know, we could arrive where we want to arrive.
So
right?
you don't agree with Donella Meadows?
The leverage points, yes. I mean, it's you know, because of course, no. I mean, maybe we could discuss it for a moment, because of course we know the whole you know, the kind of problematic of the kind of, let's say, rationalist, the rise of kind of rationalist view of the world, the kind of you know, we live in a kind of a rationalist epoch where this sort of extractivist, materialist mindset somehow emerged, right, or was created in a specific sort of historical circumstances, you know, that went hand in hand with you know, let's say the kind of rise of industrial capitalism and so on, right? And I think that this there is this, of course, the trajectory of search that you are aware of, and you are mentioning, you know, the kind of you know, indigenous epistemologies and cosmovisions and so on. And I think, you know, we now at the Venice Biennale, so there is a kind of you know, let's say a lot of architects are searching, I think, for sort of answers on this sort of you know, going to say so to the deeper, to say so, cultural roots, right, of our situation, right? And so I'm just curious to hear your commentary on that, right? Because I also find it, I mean, I would perhaps expect, okay, this is the kind of a rule book, right? But then maybe there is a kind of also the kind of a program of kind of a cultural campaign, right? Which goes hand in hand, right? That is meant to somehow re-enchant, you know, people in a different way, right? So which
which is, which would have to do with the maybe with the know-how, which would have to do with the kind of inspirations, with the kind of precedents, with concrete knowledge also, right? So that would somehow, that we would then be able to, to unpack or somehow approach the issue from a couple of different sides, right?
But don't you think that the shift is kind of in the way, because I just want to refer to, for instance, something very concrete. So the discussion on the Ersatzneubau, for instance. No, I think that this is really something where there is like a kind of technocratic approach. I mentioned the SEA kind of assuming that with 30 years you're good. I think that there is a less understanding of many other rules. Let's say that there is a portion of a sphere within the debate, the public debate, which is kind of saying, obviously these buildings are too old, and the standards are too old, and we can just kind of, by replacing them, increase life's quality and everything. And then you have another portion of the population, which is more maybe an aggregate of people who think maybe very kind of intuitively feel like this is not right, and then you would have people who actually do calculations and say it's not right, and then you have the architects who are like, well, maybe we can do that differently, So I feel like there is a kind of, the discussion is ongoing. I think that there is, for instance, an issue with the fact that a lot of these norms will be challenged within the next 5 years, where they have decided now that something will be demolished and replaced. And I was joking with a colleague who's won a competition where they would have to demolish everything, and I would be like, this project will not happen. You will have riots in front of this construction demolition sites in 5 years from now. If things move the way they do now, which is a kind of shift in the perception, the carbon shaming conversation, in a way, I think that also speaks of the urgency, which is a good thing, which is like people will not understand. And we have to have a conversation about standards, we have to have a conversation about norms, we have to have a conversation about also, again, sorry for being trivial about that, but the honoraria, the fact that you can propose something that will have less square meter, less material use, and get properly paid for that, I think means also there is a need to renegotiate all that. And then to go back to your cultural example, well, one of the discussion of Donella Meadows is also to say that the most powerful things are actually cultural shifts. So I like to refer to the example of smoking in airplanes. I smoked in airplanes. When I was like 17, it was still okay to smoke. It was not allowed to smoke 17, but I didn't know. But anyway, so I was 17. I was a smoker. I smoked in the airplanes. It was totally fine. You could smoke in the airplane. No problem. You could smoke in cinemas. There's a place where you can do that. But there is now a complete in here in Europe. Like for instance, it's not. You don't smoke in planes, you don't smoke in hospitals, you don't smoke in... It's so funny when you see these scenes in old movies, it's 20 years. The law is not so old, no? People would smoke on the workplace. I smoked in my atelier. I know that people still do that secretly.
Yeah,
anyway,
I remember SPB train.
The smoking thing. So I think that the cultural shift that we talk about, I think for me, my success would be that in 20 years it would be completely unacceptable and no one would even imagine to demolish an existing building. No one would do it.
You know who was employing these rules? It was the politics.
Of course.
And I think that's exactly the point where you also see, for example, Switzerland is maybe not on the same level as, for example, now in Brussels, or where you have already on the politics, if you demolish something, you need first to prove why you do it. So, I think like that you have to pay for it. And if you demolish, you have to have a proper plan of how you do it, how you can reuse the elements that you kind of destroy. But I think that's why I think a lot of these things, the architect office or the architect can choose how he wants to work now when he starts to, or not everyone. It's also a bit.
Maybe just one more question for Maria, because it's precisely on this point. No, so that kind of let's say reparative. Okay, let's say
it will be somewhere in between, partly, kind of cultural or aesthetic driven, and partly maybe there will be a sort of rule book and so on. But this kind of knowledge, so imagine we are in this kind of, let's say, ideal world, there will be no new construction, architects will work on existing buildings, right? And I think this is, in some way, it's already a norm at the Department of Architecture. A lot of studios are not, in fact, offering, like, courses or studios in designing new buildings, but you have also recently or currently even offered the studios in existing buildings, repurposing office buildings in Zurich into housing, right? So this is also currently it's a kind of a hypothetical practice because it's not what we're currently seeing too much of happening. I mean, maybe partly because there's a lot of demolition.
The data is half-half. The EU data is half-half. Half practice is new, half practice is refurbishing. It's half-half. Currently, and it's slightly shifting to the new.
So it's interesting.
Great.
I mean, it's interesting. What it means in terms of education, right? So, and in a way, if this sort of reparative practice should also operate within this kind of a non-extractivist framework, right? So that means you have to have a complete sort of awareness and control of the materials you're working with, right? And I think I find it fascinating that until throughout the 20th century, I mean, and until very recently, we are educated to work with kind of industrial systems, industrialized building components. Does this speak in favor of some kind of new kind of concreteness, right? In terms of, logic of construction, right? So you have to be ultra specific. Does that? How do you reflect on that? In your practices or in your studios, what do you see as problems?
I mean, it's something else, the studio, than the practice, I would say. But in the practice, we are working very much with existing structures. So there, the difficulties is to fulfill the norms. And that's something that makes then that the new structures often are cheaper. And that's a whole... but that's also a very important point in this whole thing that, working in existing structures, all the things you have to do, so it's a very difficult thing. And I think also, and that's the point, as soon as you start to make the calculation, I think everything that you keep is good because it really, you save a lot of CO2. And then for example, you need to know a lot about materials because if you work in existing structures, you have to know how it's done. So you really dig into the way of how things are done. How could you add things? What do you have to change? What happens if you cut out this or you put this away? To adapt structures means you need really knowledge about structure and about materials, how they work, and also what would be a good material to add. No, not everything is as easy as other, or as not every material is as easy to use for adaptations and extensions as, for example, I mean, the good thing is that wood also works there very well. And then there is the way of working in the studio, and I think there you have different scales also. So you have 12 weeks or 14 weeks to do a project, so you won't be able to work on the materials as on the conceptual level. So I think what I always think is very important is that you learn to look at the existing structures to develop a way of dealing or kind of, because it's like, it's not that you have an empty plot and you build rooms, but you have like a structure and you have to understand the structure and you have to know the history of the structure, and that makes then of how you can work with it. No? So it's this kind of, I think, precise looking at the environment discovering things in the detail. So I think in this sense, yes, I think we have to be more aware of the things that are around us. And I think there it's also interesting, just a lot of these constructions are done, for example, in Zurich with brick that was produced in Zurich. So also to discover or rediscover things that are here around. And I think that's also something that's now interesting in this example that you showed of this structure out of wood, where you can say that you go back to learn again of how you constructed 100 years ago, because there you were kind of working with the material that you found on site, and I think that's very important also in the way on your kind of economical level, no? I mean, and that's why I think, yes, we have to be very aware of materials and how things are done and how you can put things together. Yes.
Yes. I mean, first, thank you. I think it's actually a great last session. I mean, we had like a repair of architectural pedagogies, repair of the office, repair of nature rights, and I think this as kind of the umbrella, also theoretical, but also very crystal kind of thought. I think it was very precise and to the point. And I wanted to ask, and maybe also what Maria was saying, like we were speaking about this architect and architectural practice. So this made me think of the architects to be, because from what I understand from also what you are saying is this kind of a little bit of unaccountability on this kind of maybe accepted cluelessness of the architect, like of all these kind of extractivist methods, let's say, of the harm that we are doing. So, and maybe in that kind of reforming the school, you're kind of, in a way, as I understand, proposing that maybe the curricula changes so that when there is political economy involved, political ecology, etc., so that the architects to be then are these people that are maybe out of that the myth of the architect thought, where it's like, I design, architects from architect, and designers will design, and out of that maybe also within their small practices that could start tackling with these kind of issues that we're experiencing and maybe get some results. So I mean, how do you see that in maybe like kind of open it up a bit on this kind of education?
I just, and I think this would be interesting to really ping pong, but so the project I showed, the Mumbai project, for instance, was basically designing maintenance protocols. I mean, I have no idea how to do maintenance protocols. It's not something I learned in school. No, but it's true. It's not something I learned in school. It's not clear how you would get to this knowledge, except from like just learning by doing, I guess. It's not something that the client will ask you, probably. So what we did, we reached out to architects who's like a preservationist, and he knows how to do maintenance protocols because he works with exceptional buildings. So for instance, he did a maintenance protocol, he's called David Fisher, he's a very knowledgeable person. So he did a maintenance protocol for a Gehry building because people have no clue how to hammer a nail into the stuff. I mean, I don't remember which one it is. It was a cultural center or something like that. Also, how do you actually clean the surfaces, all this stuff? And in a way, it was useful because we could say, well, why is this not something that we would know how to do first, like learn? I mean, there is so much things to learn, but if we kind of shift the way that we perceive the profession and its task, and if we're able to also rewire the honoraria and the client, and in a way the kind of like through the politics, but it means that the knowledge that we need to somehow acquire to be architects that are making spaces within the existing needs to shift also. And so for instance, you would need a maintenance class which you can then ground in larger realms of theory and of feminist practice. I mean, the maintenance discussion is very much grounded into that, but there is a kind of very applied way of learning how to do maintenance protocols, which I think also begs the question of what kind of materials are you going to choose when you design something, which is, do you actually think about how this is going to be cleaned? How is this going to be accessed? I mean, you can see this on towers where you have this kind of like terrifying structures of like people doing this kind of work, so like extremely well paid because they're doing an incredibly dangerous job, kind of people doing this with this rope. I mean, it's just a kind of dramatic example, but then also how, I have an apartment which is a Neubau, by the way, new construction, which doesn't have plinths. It's like, why are there no plinths? Like, what's the deal with that? It was about saving money? Because now what is happening is that the reason you have plinths is that because when you're brooming, you otherwise destroy your wall. So the disappearance of the plinth, you could write a whole piece about that, like, for instance, I mean, I think that there is a kind of, also, I mean, the conversation you can have this conversation really at all levels, like the politicized details, like the choice of how you design the kind of essentiality of a piece, whether it's going to drip. I don't know. Like, I think that this is really something that can be addressed across the board. And to your question on knowledge, I think there would be a need to, within this kind of change, shift in ecology.
Again, a cultural shift.
But it's not very far. I mean, why not teach a seminar on maintenance protocols?
No, I
mean, I
think
know that there were
very
works, but they were very theoretical. I think there would be a kind of very, like the politicization of the detail. I think is really something that, I mean, I wrote a piece on that, but I haven't, like, that would be another book. But it's like how, but the detail is really like, okay, how do I rely on existing details? Do I conceptualize the detail myself and open up to like failure and to being sued because my building is leaking? Who's paying for my insurance? I mean, it's kind of like, it really opens up a whole complete discussion on like how are things being, how are we held accountable to what we do.
I think this behavior is more like very connected to your presentation, that we somehow doubt the completion of the architecture, right? Because like I think modernity or industrialization brought this idea of like a client, architect, also builder, and like kind of building up, and they sell them, and afterwards like architect and builder doesn't care about it. I think before it was more like organic, that they kind of live and fix, and they also like change according to their life, also like culture change. And this idea of like kind of living architecture is lost because of this kind of service-oriented architecture. So one cell and the architect is like off. And I think this idea of this like kind of taking off this completion is we have to kind of bring to the school. Then it's associated to how to maintain, associated how to demolish and bring back to the soil. All the circulation is like kind of will be in consideration. So I think this is the point which I understood from your presentation. And you somehow like open up the black boxes, how the materials took from the nature. Because like I think I remember that when I working in the office, I was just choosing the materials from catalog, and no information like a background of these materials. And I think it's also connected to the role of architects, or like as an office, gonna be kind of the node to open up this like black boxes, because a client cannot reach because they are not professional and they're not educated, but the architect who are kind of all the hub of the knowledges, skills, materiality, demolition, and to be the waste, we could open up and bring this information and showing to client, and also we can discuss what we should choose. What does it make sense in this knowledge? That I think.
I mean, I could, just sort of thinking the similar argument in perhaps through a different lens. I could say something like, we could imagine a kind of a political ecology of space production, right? And in this perspective, it would be, and I think that will, in a way, it will come up as a question in the moratorium. It's the question of the power structures along the supply chain, right? And so let's say architect is somewhere, right? And I think the offices are also somewhere, and of course they are not even having the equal role. And as you pointed, the office, to say so, is a structure which is sort of somehow spread all over the supply chain, doing different kind of services, the different degrees of influence and so on, right? And so in a way there are offices and counter offices and the critical practices and all of that, no? And I think that the one level here, which also came, and you pointed out, Maria, why is it that new construction is cheaper, than retaining existing? I mean, it's a kind of absurdity which has to do with the basically the sort of the kind of a problematic incentivization of economy, right? So certain actors are empowered to produce new, right? And the other ones, are let's say the kind of the logic of the system does not support. So, so I think, I mean, one of the implications that comes out of that is like, how do we shift the system, and this comes to the leverage points, right? So I think one way to think about it would be the state or the institutions, right? So they will change the order of priorities, carbon will figure more prominently, therefore, constructing new will become radically more expensive, etc., etc. No. The other way to think about it would be to say, well, the kind of financial institutions will step in to support, for example, kind of a, cooperative organizations. Because, for example, you cannot, let's say, as a housing cooperative, you cannot save an existing building because the investor will offer more money, right? You do not have financial system backing up cooperative organizations. For instance, in a city like Zurich, right? There are many examples where the kind of building from the 70s is torn down because pension fund wants to build another thing, etc., right? So this is so in a way, so we are asking the public institutions, financial institutions, right?
All along the chain there is a potential to change.
Exactly, all along the chain. So in a way, but somehow this perhaps, I mean, I think it's instead of maybe the discourse on leverage points, I mean, you can go back to the questions of power, right? So who is empowered ultimately to operate, and why does not the system support other kind of constellations? So and I think in that sense, so in a way, I think, for instance, I mean, from our, let's say, from our teaching or from our angle, you know, working with territory and the landscape and so on, right? So let's say cooperatives, right, or communes, right? So the kind of, let's say, the bodies of small sort of governance or small protagonists, right? So those we can look at many examples. Let's say in agriculture, to give an example, like Milchgenossenschaft, you know, Wassergenossenschaft, and so on. So that were very common during the 19th and 20th century, or have basically disappeared or kind of lost influence, right? So in a way, a similar thread can be traced in the urban environment, right? So in a way, also, for instance, the home ownership, right? I mean, if you a large or it's a sort of a growing proportion of people who are renting in Switzerland, right? So in a way, if you have a society of rentiers, I mean, you cannot. The housing questions is fundamentally related to the right of housing. You know? So in a way, we are. So in a way, I'm curious how, perhaps as a last question, but sort of this discussion, through the perspective of power. Right? So in a way, as architects, having also a sort of a different. Different kinds of clients, right? Having a sort of a more democratic situation where I think a lot more people and a lot more smaller organizations are empowered to act, right, in the situation of space production, right? I think that would be much more interesting, because there would be more diversity and kind of more freedom to move, right? So in a way, as you described, architect, a rigid system of rules, a few big clients, and basically, very few things can move. What do you say?
No, I mean, I have identified in this work a few low-hanging fruits, which I'm trying to kind of also act upon. So the black spot, they actually correspond to a research package, which corresponds to PhDs, which corresponds to campaigns and things like that. So I'm waiting for the SNSF to give me some money to do that. But it doesn't matter if we don't get the money, then we'll find some other money. But for instance, I'll just backpedal to the SEA, which I think in a way, especially in the context of Switzerland, is empowered to do a lot of changes, and if there was a serious rewriting of these norms, we'd be able to actually achieve it. So to me, that's a very low-hanging fruit. It's not something that requires, I mean, we're in conversation with them and they're not super responsive, I have to say, but okay, maybe you have a better entry point. I'm interested, but I think that in a way they're in a position of relative power, but if they are very well respected, they're also validated by insurance companies and things like that. So if you do things according to them, you will be fine in a lot of ways. So if they change many things, from the competition briefs to the norms to the acoustic norms. I mean, currently, again, going back to my Neubau, I mean, when I close the window of my apartment, I don't hear the city. I'm like in a tomb. It's very strange. I open the window. I mean, I don't need that. I'm okay with hearing my neighbor walking in the city. I think this is kind of obviously it speaks of like completely over-designed norms, and it's just an example where I think that there would be a limit of material use, and also something related to the existing that would be, I mean, we know the current disputes about housing and kind of, let's say, acoustic norms in the city of Zurich. So, I mean, that is, for example, one example. And then there are like other places in the system where you would require more economical courage and political courage, which is, for instance, the whole debate on insulation.
For instance, if the state would have the courage to enter into a nationalization debate of the materialization of like, how do you actually get to, if we insulate currently the way we insulate our houses, except for like a very niche practice on hay and kind of like alternative methods, is pretty much to wrap them in rock wool, which is using the same kind of it's 1950 degrees to turn your rock into insulation material. So in terms of carbon, it's not great, right? So if the state was serious about this whole insulation debate, they would enter into pushing the production of alternative methods of construction of insulation that would make the insulation process something that would be actually sustainable. Currently, it's not. I mean, we're wrapping our houses in plastic and in rock wool. It makes no sense. So I think that there, for instance, would be something that could, change the entire conversation on insulation, for instance. I feel like at every level there would be something. You talk about also the financing. So, for instance, if you want to, there is a whole debate in France about like insulation of getting subsidies for insulation. So I tried to get insulation for my mom's house. It's impossible. She doesn't live there in that house enough. She earns too much. I can guarantee you it's not that much. Right? It's just like, and then she would need, it's like 3,000 euros to insulate the roof because she's making the roof new. She will not get a cent. It's just an example of how also this kind of greenwashing discourse is not followed by kind of action. So at that level, the power dynamics are more political and obviously not where they should be. But I feel like the lower you go in the kind of line, the question of like choosing your materials, this is something that architects do a lot.
Can I?
Yeah, of course, jump in.
Yeah, because I think that's.
I
just wanted to say before. I think that's very interesting that you talk about these black boxes, because these are really black boxes, no? Because you often make research about things and you don't get further because people just don't know it. To ask if a kind of how you say Spanplatte.
The concrete.
No, it's this kind of the kitchen front, that is done, and you have different woods that are inside, and you ask, for example, can you guarantee that there is no wood from a tropical wood in it? No one can guarantee that. No one knows what is in his Spanplatte. So that's quite plywood. That's quite strange, because in food and everywhere we have now the whole chain of where it's
traceability.
We know nothing. We know really.
There are discussions on material passports. There is conversations on that, but I don't know exactly where that's heading.
Yeah, and I think that would be why we don't do the same thing, and there is really everything is in a way written and declared. I don't know. It really feels so much behind everything. This kind of construction industry. It's really like something, and I'm completely with you. I don't know why there is not this kind of like you have to be your food, no? Where you could say you do the same with the material, and then you pay more, but you also know that there are better conditions where people work in. So all of that is not really happening, and I think that's that's more on a global and more on a. It's less about the architects again, because I think often, you try to do things and you realize you're just not.
Yeah, but I think we would also have to be honest about the fact that all of that is additional work.
Yeah,
I think that the debate I had, like this kind of, the email that got back about the office was also kind of pointing at that, which I think is a very fair point. Is that in a way, we are asked to be aware of everything, and for instance, to trace, say, the plywood, and to be kind of, if this one's not good, then I'm going to look for another one that's going to take me a few more hours, and who's going to pay for that? So I think that there is a kind of also need to be, not to drag it at the level of like the trivial level of like how we get to our money, but I think that without a kind of frank conversation on that, to kind of also expect people to be doing this thing without a kind of clear mandate, and then we track back to the level of the policies. No, it's like in a way those things are kind of interconnected, I believe, and.
I think if we if we started to trace the the traceability, and if you started to choose like a better one, not probably always best one, but the better one, I think better one will be the majority. And I think this is the chance to change the system as well. Also, like the price gets probably reasonable. So I think this is like how we can kind of access to the system, no?
And we also have knowledge about these things. Like for instance, I remember when I really practiced last time 10 years ago. I'm so glad I'm out of that. I'm going back to it, however, because it's another project, another lecture. No, I mean it's within the frame of critical spatial practices, like engaging back into like the dirt. But for instance, 10 years ago, everyone used epoxy. Epoxy was fantastic, especially in renovation. Fantastic epoxy. You have your horrible floor, and then you just like pour tons of epoxy, and then it's like liters of epoxy, and then it looks fantastic. It's bright. It's like amazing. You can never remove it from the existing floor. It's a complete disaster in terms of like design for disassembly, but it looked amazing. So we did it. We were like, it's still there. It will still be there for another, I don't know, until the building is demolished. So, I mean, I think the awareness, for instance, like, okay, can't use epoxy anymore.
No, we don't.
I never used it. So sorry,
it looks amazing. It looks amazing.
We would,
but I think we were not. But I think the question of like awareness, for instance, like 10 years ago, maybe it was like still okay to use epoxy. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think that epoxy is really there.
Yeah,
maybe
it's
10
funny
years
that
ago.
you talk about that because I was now. Yeah, there were a lot of projects.
I mean, because it's a really easy, cheap material to kind of.
And you can put color in.
You can put materials in it. You can throw paillettes and like it's fantastic. I mean, it looks great. It doesn't age too bad. I mean, it's a fantastic material, but it's basically pouring oil over your project, right? And in the kind of the most horrible way.
No, but I think also that's something we talk a lot about, the construction, or that you talk about the layering, that you think about that you can repair it. So that means you think about these kind of things get older in different ways, so you need to be able to take another layer away before
there is agency there. That's like a point where you can really say, well, because the client wouldn't know.
No, but that's the thing.
That looks good. But you know, and in a way, I think that there is also agency in this kind of selection of tracing your plywood, and then also telling the client, this one's more expensive, but this one really is a problem. I think that there is also like this kind of educational layer.
Yeah, also this knowledge changes the people, like understanding of our kind of judgment of aesthetic, no? Like beauty was like beautiful, like
it's more important how it will look than what it actually carries in it. But I think that's key to also the discussion on like rewiring the profession and the idea that you mold the material to your design desire, right, in the end, and whatever is not about that is secondary, and I think that has to change. I mean, this is really kind of, I think that's a key decision. It's like it might not look the way I would like for it to look, but it's the right thing to do. So I think that there is a complete and then how do you separate it afterwards and where it's coming from. I mean, this kind of complete knowledge of, I mean, there is really agency.
I mean, it's interesting. Maybe as a last question, because the time has run out a long time ago.
But people are still here, but they might leave. Please don't go.
Because
there is booze.
Siblings are waiting for all of us, and also a nice apero for everybody.
Okay, last question.
So the last question. So politics of details and rewriting the rule book. So I understand where you're heading. So this is really sort of a hands-on engagement. I mean, I think rules are very good because these are concrete documents, and we can go through them and underline and rewrite, and so this really makes a lot of sense. But also the kind of I mean, the testing of the let's say testing of a design, right? So you could
how will you go about it in your studios? I mean, you could design like I don't know a concrete. You know, you could work with your studio and design like one-to-one and work on the politics of details in the studio in one-to-one, for example, no?
Yeah, of course.
Like, I mean, where are you heading with your teaching, you know, in that sense? I'm curious.
So the teaching currently follows, every second semester we follow the moratorium point. So now we're at stop building iteration 2 because the first one was a bit of a beta. And for instance, next semester, so not this one, but the one after, we'll do fix the office. So we look at the value. No, but we look at how do you
different ways of
look at how other offices work, and then also think about potentially new forms of doing that, and then how that actually materializes in a kind of like very practical way. So for instance, that would be one thing. But I have now students who are working on how you can accommodate these 30,000 newcomers just by moving things within the fabric. So if you move things, and then they're confronted to the fact that they are moving materials. So what happens when you cut a wall and things like that? They were like, today we had a Zoom call where they were like, we created warme Brücke, pont thermique. I don't know what's the English term.
Heat bridge.
A heat bridge. And I was like, okay, so how do you deal with that? You know, like, do you create an additional box around your thing, or do you admit that there is a bridge here and you insulate another? You know, like this kind of TAC Architects recent project that was published, where you have only one portion of the house which is, for instance, warm, and the rest will be then for lesser warm, or like when it's hotter, or I mean the kind of decisions that you will take if you do that. That's a one-to-one. So they're drawing a detail. So I mean, I think that the scalability of all these things is really important, but also the fact that you acknowledge that at every level there is something to be done. So it's a strategy. It always starts with the strategy, and then it moves to. But it can be go to the details.
There is also. Do you think that there is a kind of aesthetic
It's the second
shift?
question.
Sorry, because I feel that I can't. I have
you
to
can't
ask
let it go.
It's the same, right?
Okay.
Okay.
Aesthetic.
Yeah, I mean, is there an aesthetic shift in all that, right? You know, like will we see, you know, a better and a more beautiful world emerging, right? Then I think we should.
It's interesting that you look at this from the other way, because when I studied, I was always there was this kind of assumption that all political and social projects, like everything that would be like in this realm, will automatically look like shit. Like, there is a kind of like given that if it's somehow relevant, it's going to look horrible. So this idea that the molding, that if you let go, it's not control, it's looking whatever. And so there is a kind of impossible friction there. I actually hold tight to the idea that politically, socially relevant projects have to look amazing. So I pay a lot of attention to how things actually look, because I don't think that it's dissociable. It might mean that things might not look the way you want. There is a question of a new aesthetics. I mean, something that yeah, exactly. Also, kind of surrender to kind of a possible. I mean, not being fully controlling the entire thing, but like also being nevertheless intentional about what, you know. For instance, we talked about choosing a certain marmor. We have a project who's looking at like services and care, and so whether you choose marmor, for instance, for a cabinet where you're going to store your brooms, you know, the kind of like political commentary that there is there, which also carries the idea that something that is, I mean, the value shift in a way also comes with aesthetics. I think that these things are not necessarily the same. I mean, I would argue for new aesthetics of a reinvented discipline that are not necessarily, that are beautiful. So in a way, I don't think that this. I'm on the fence.
I really hope so. You know, it's really interesting. But maybe that
So I'm really eager also for that chapter, right?
Oh my God, it's not written.
It's not written, but okay, maybe it's the next book. But you know, I think that this because I think the you know, aesthetics is sort of another way to
Be sufficient.
to learn, right?
Yeah.
You know, the kind of a different way to respond to the environment and to learn, right? As an architect, right? So I'm really curious. So come. We'll invite you again. Then you have to show us.
Okay, I'll come
When you start.
Yes.
So well, thanks a lot. And now the apero.
Thank you.